The most dangerous thing you can do to a powerful person is make them feel small. And history is absolutely littered with the wreckage of people who forgot that. Not the glamorous kind of wreckage either, not the noble cinematic revenge you see in movies where someone stares into the distance and delivers a perfect line before riding off. The real stuff is messier, pettier, and honestly way more fascinating. We are talking about rulers who declared war on weather. Scientists who erased a man's face from existence out of pure spite. A widow who turned birds into weapons. A businessman who responded to one dismissive sentence by building an entire industry just to prove a point. These are the stories that history books bury in footnotes because they are too embarrassing to put in the main text. Too human. Too recognizable. Because if you are being honest with yourself, you have felt that exact same heat in your chest when someone made you feel like nothing. The difference between you and the people on this list is simply the size of the budget and the absence of anyone willing to say, hey, maybe let's not. 33 stories, every single one of them real. And I promise you, the further down this list we go, the more you are going to question everything you thought you knew about how history actually gets made. Because here's the thing nobody tells you in school. History is not mostly driven by strategy or vision or grand ideas about the future. A shocking amount of it is driven by someone having a really bad day and having just enough power to make it everyone else's problem. Let's start there. Let's start with a really bad day. If you are enjoying this so far, please hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you might think, and there is a lot more coming that you do not want to miss. Picture this. A man walks into one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. He is not dressed like a tourist. He is not nervous or loud or out of place. He moves through rooms like someone who has owned things his entire life, which, to be fair, he has. He has owned a lot of things. Companies, properties, stakes and ventures most people never even hear about. He is, by any reasonable measure, one of the wealthiest private individuals on the planet. The host at the front looks him over and decides, based on whatever invisible calculation people like that make in 3 seconds, that this man does not belong at the table he is heading toward. He is stopped, told politely, in that particular clipped tone that expensive places use when they want to humiliate someone without technically being rude, that the section is reserved, that perhaps he would like to wait, that perhaps there has been some misunderstanding. The man nods. He does not raise his voice. He does not demand to speak to anyone. He finishes the rest of his evening elsewhere, quiet and unremarkable. And the host probably forgets about him before the shift ends. The next morning, the paperwork goes through. The building changes hands. Not the restaurant. The entire building, along with everything in it, including the employment contracts of every single member of staff. By midday, the host who had pointed this man toward the waiting area is no longer employed there. Now, did every detail of this story survive history exactly as it happened? Probably not. Stories like this pick up a little shine every time they get retold. A sharper edge here. A cleaner detail there, but the reason this particular story has survived, the reason people repeat it at dinner tables and business meetings and late-night conversations, is not because it is dramatic It is because it is precise. No shouting, no confrontation, no scene, just a quiet transaction that permanently rearranged one person's life. He did not get angry. He got organized. And that gap between anger and organization is where the most devastating revenge in history tends to live. Hold that thought, because the next story takes it somewhere much, much darker. Now imagine taking that same impulse, that same quiet, controlled fury, and giving it not a checkbook, but an army of 50,000 men. Because the next story is what happens when the person who feels small has absolutely no one left in the world who is allowed to tell them no. A military commander, one of the most celebrated in the ancient world, had spent years building a reputation for being unstoppable. Every obstacle had a solution. Every enemy had a weakness. Every problem, no matter how large, could be solved with enough will and enough resources. And then one morning, after months of preparation, after moving tens of thousands of soldiers and animals and supplies across enormous distances, after building 2 massive rope bridges across a wide stretch of open water, a storm came in overnight and tore both of them apart. Not damaged, not weakened, gone. He stood on the bank the next morning, looking at the wreckage floating in the water below, and felt something he was not built to process. Embarrassment. In front of his entire army. The water had, in the most visible and public way possible, made him look like a man who did not know what he was doing. And that, for someone who had built an identity entirely on being the man who always knew exactly what he was doing, was not a setback. It was a personal attack. What he ordered next is the part that historians have been shaking their heads at for centuries. He did not call his engineers back. He did not spend the day redesigning the bridges. He ordered soldiers to march to the water's edge and beat the surface with rods. Not symbolically, actually hit the water, hard, repeatedly, as punishment. Then he had heavy chains brought down and thrown into the current, as though the river could be placed in restraints, as though nature had committed a crime and needed to understand that crimes had consequences. The soldiers did it, because of course they did. Nobody in that army was going to be the one to step forward and say, "Sir, this is not going to work. The water does not know it did something wrong." And that is the part of this story that stays with you long after the spectacle fades. Not the image of soldiers whipping a river, as bizarre as that is. It is the silence around it. 50,000 people watching their commander wage war on geography, and not one of them saying a word. Because when someone has that much power, reality itself starts to bend around their feelings. Not physically, but socially. Everyone nearby quietly agrees to treat the delusion as reasonable, because the alternative is unthinkable. The bridges were eventually rebuilt. The campaign continued, and that episode got filed away in the historical record as one of those things that happened. A footnote dressed up as a curiosity. But it is not a curiosity. It is a warning. It is what power looks like when it runs out of legitimate targets and turns toward the nearest available thing that dared to be inconvenient. Now hold that image in your mind. The commander on the bank, the silent army, the chains disappearing into the current. Because what comes next is the same story, told in a completely different register. No armies, no open water, just 2 men, a shared institution, and one of them slowly, deliberately making sure the other one stopped existing. There is a detail that most people walk right past when they study the history of science. One of the most consequential figures in the field, a man whose ideas reshaped the way humans understood the physical world, has no confirmed image that survives from his lifetime. Not a single verified portrait, not a sketch, not a wax impression, nothing. For someone that prominent, that connected, that embedded in the institutions of his time, that absence is not an accident of history. Gaps like that do not just happen. They get made. The man who almost certainly made that gap had been in a bitter, years-long conflict with the person whose image disappeared. The rivalry was intellectual at first, then personal, then something harder to name. A low, cold obsession that never fully burned out. When the rival died and the survivor rose to lead the very institution that held all the records, all the portraits, all the physical evidence of a person's existence, the timing of that disappearance becomes very difficult to explain as coincidence. He never admitted to anything. He was far too precise for that. And that precision is exactly what makes it so chilling. A group of armed men kidnapped a young aristocrat and expected him to beg. Instead, he told them their ransom demand was an insult and suggested they double it. Think about that for a second. You are being held against your will, surrounded by people who are very comfortable with violence, and your first instinct is to negotiate upward because you feel undervalued. That is not courage in the normal sense. That is something closer to a person so completely convinced of their own worth that the concept of fear simply did not have enough room to fit inside them. During the weeks that followed, he treated his captivity like a mildly inconvenient business trip. He ate their food. He slept in their camp. He joined their card games in the evenings and was apparently quite good at them. He also talked constantly, the way someone talks when they are completely relaxed, telling long stories, making jokes, and occasionally, almost as an aside, reminding his captors in plain and specific language exactly what was going to happen to each of them once he was free. Not angry, not threatening, the way you might remind someone about a meeting on Tuesday. They laughed. Every single time they laughed. Because what else do you do when a man in your custody keeps calmly describing his own rescue as though it is already scheduled in his diary? The ransom was paid. He walked out of the camp without looking back. Within a matter of weeks, he had assembled a group, tracked down the men who had held him, and delivered on every single thing he had described during those long evenings around the fire. Every detail. The men who had laughed the loudest probably stopped laughing first, because they would have remembered most clearly that he had never once seemed to be joking. That is what separates this story from ordinary revenge. Most people, when they feel powerless, either collapse or explode. He did something much more unsettling. He simply continued, as though the captivity were a minor detour on a road he had already mapped. His composure during those weeks was not calm. It was patience wearing the mask of calm. And patience, when it is backed by genuine intent, is the most dangerous thing a person can carry. The lesson here is not that confidence wins. The lesson is that when someone tells you clearly and repeatedly what they plan to do, and you choose not to believe them because you cannot imagine them actually doing it, That failure of imagination is entirely on you. Those men had every piece of information they needed. They just assumed no one would actually follow through on something that specific, that detailed, that certain. They were wrong in a way that could not be undone. And now we get to a story that proves revenge does not always wear a threatening face. Sometimes it wears a business suit and smells like engine oil and speaks in the quiet, measured language of someone who has just made a very large decision. A man who had spent the better part of his working life building machines from the ground up knew how things worked. Not in the theoretical sense, in the hands-on, grease-on-the-knuckles, standing in a factory at 6 in the morning sense. He had built a successful company. He had money. And when he decided to reward himself with the kind of luxury car that announced to the world that you had arrived, he bought one of the finest available, drove it for a few months, and discovered a flaw. The same flaw, repeating itself, mechanical and stubborn, and completely fixable to anyone who actually looked at it properly. He went to the man who ran the company. Not aggressively. He brought the problem the way an engineer brings a problem. Clearly, specifically, with the solution already half formed in his mind. And the man across the desk looked at him, let a beat of silence pass, and said something that amounted to, "You build tractors. Leave the real work to people who understand it." The room probably smelled like leather and money and the specific kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong about anything in public. The man who had just been dismissed nodded, stood up, and left. He did not call back. He did not write a letter. He went home and started designing. Within 2 years, he had a factory. Within a few more, he had cars on the road that made people stop walking and just stare. The company he built from that one dismissive afternoon grew into one of the most recognized names in the world, a name that still carries the exact energy of that original moment. Quiet fury refined into something beautiful and permanent. He never needed to say he had won. The cars said it for him, on every road, at every speed, for decades after both men were gone. And somewhere in that story is a reminder that the sharpest response to being told you do not belong is simply to build something that makes the question irrelevant. But if you think building an empire is the most extreme thing wounded pride ever produced, wait until you hear what one man did with 7 years, a list of names, and absolutely nothing left to lose. He spent 7 years in a cell for something he did not do. And when he walked out, the first thing he did was make a list. Not a list of things to buy or places to visit or people to reconnect with. A list of names. 4 names, to be exact. The 4 men who had put him there. Men he had trusted. Men who had sat at his table and eaten his food and then, when it became convenient, quietly pointed a finger in his direction and walked away clean while he disappeared into a prison that smelled of damp stone and other people's misery. He had a lot of time to think in there. 7 years is a long time to sit with something. Long enough for the hot, sharp anger of the early days to cool down and harden into something much more durable. Something that does not shout. Something that plans. When he came out, he looked different. Thinner, quieter, with the kind of stillness that people who have never been truly desperate tend to mistake for calm. He found a modest place to stay. He took small jobs. He relearned how to move through the world without drawing attention. And while he did all of that, he was also doing something else entirely. He was watching. Each of the 4 men had built a life in the years he was gone. One had a business that depended on a particular supplier relationship. One had a reputation that rested on a single, carefully maintained lie. One had debts that nobody outside a small circle knew about. One had a family situation that was fragile in ways that only someone paying close attention would notice. He paid close attention to all of it. He never approached any of them directly. He never sent a message or made a phone call or appeared anywhere near their daily lives. He worked entirely through distance, through information, through the slow and deliberate pressure of someone who understood that the most devastating thing you can do to a person is not to hit them once hard, but to stand just outside their field of vision and quietly remove every support beam they have been leaning on. The first one lost his supplier contract when a piece of information reached the wrong ears at exactly the right moment. The second watched his carefully maintained reputation crack open when documents surfaced that nobody was supposed to find. The third had his debts called in from 3 directions at once in a single week. The fourth, the one who had been most vocal in the original accusation, had the longest wait, which was deliberate. He needed time to watch the others fall first and understand that it was not bad luck. At a certain point, each of them would have known, not because anyone told them, because the pattern was too clean, too precise, too perfectly aimed at the specific things each of them valued most. Randomness does not work like a surgeon. This did. And in that moment of recognition, when each man understood that someone had been watching them for years and had been patiently taking everything apart from the outside, that moment was the actual revenge. Not the losses themselves, the realization. He never met any of them again, never needed to. The work was done from a distance, with the cold efficiency of someone who had decided a long time ago that this was not about anger anymore. It was about balance. He had lost 7 years. He had decided that each of them would lose something they could not get back either. He considered that fair. Whether it actually was fair is a different question. And it is a question worth sitting with, because the line between justice and obsession is thinner than most revenge stories want to admit. But at least in that story, the damage was personal, targeted, aimed at the specific people responsible. What comes next is the story of how one broken window in a small shop somehow ended up as a naval blockade. And it is possibly the most gloriously absurd diplomatic disaster in recorded history. A small business owner filed a damages claim. That is where it starts. A modest shop, a broken door, some ruined stock. The kind of loss that in any normal situation would be handled with an insurance form and a repair bill. But this particular claim landed inside a pile of other grievances that a government had been quietly accumulating for years. The kind of pile that grows because nobody wants to deal with it, until suddenly somebody does. The pile became a formal complaint. The complaint became a demand. The demand was ignored. The government behind the demand decided that being ignored was not acceptable, and that a show of force would clarify the situation. The show of force involved warships, actual warships, anchored off the coast of a major port, blocking incoming and outgoing trade, turning an entire city's economy into a hostage while diplomats argued about what the original grievances were actually worth. People lost livelihoods. Supply chains broke down. Prices inside the city spiked within days. All of this traceable in a direct and unbroken line back to a shopkeeper who had filed a completely reasonable claim about a broken door and some ruined stock. The broader political pressures were real. The debts, the instability, the accumulated frustration of years of unresolved disputes, those things mattered. But the detail that survived, the one that got attached to this entire episode and never let go, was the shop. Because when you name a conflict after the smallest possible thing that contributed to it, history is not being careless. History is being honest about how these things actually begin, not with grand ideological clashes. With someone feeling dismissed, someone else refusing to respond, and a series of choices that each seemed reasonable in isolation and catastrophic in combination. And if you think that is the most disproportionate response to a minor grievance on this list, you have not heard about the woman who answered her husband's murder by building a private military operation from scratch. They killed her husband on a Tuesday, and by Friday she had already started making plans. Not grieving plans, not funeral plans, something else entirely. The kind of plans that require paper and ink and a very specific kind of cold clarity that only arrives after the hot part of grief has burned itself out, and what is left underneath is something harder and quieter and much more purposeful. Her husband had been a ruler, powerful enough to have real enemies, important enough that removing him required coordination, a network of people who had decided that the world would work better without him in it. They expected his death to create a vacuum. They expected her to be part of that vacuum. A grieving woman in a large house with no army and no options. They had made their calculation based on what they thought she was. That was their mistake, and it turned out to be a significant one. She did not move fast. Fast would have been stupid, and she was not stupid. She spent weeks watching, gathering information, learning exactly who had been involved and how deeply each of them had participated. She mapped the network the way you map a building before you take it apart, starting with the structure, understanding which pieces were load-bearing, identifying the sequence that would cause the most complete collapse. Then she began. The first stage was almost invisible. A border dispute resolved in a way that quietly cut off a supply line one of the factions depended on. A marriage arrangement that fell through at a critical moment, leaving a key ally isolated. Small things, deniable things. The kind of moves that look like ordinary political weather until you zoom out and see the pattern. She gave them time to feel the pressure without understanding where it was coming from. The second stage was less subtle. She invited the inner circle to a gathering, the kind of formal occasion that carries enough ceremony around it that declining feels like a political statement. They came. The food was good. The atmosphere was tense in the way that all such gatherings are tense when everyone in the room knows that power has recently shifted and nobody is quite sure where it is settled. She was gracious and composed and gave nothing away. What happened after the food and the formality is the part that ends the story of that particular faction. She did not do it in a moment of rage. She did not do it as a spectacle. She did it with the efficiency of someone who had been planning it for months and had decided that clean and final was better than dramatic and incomplete. The detail that history remembers, the one that got attached to her name permanently, was what she did with the city at the end. The faction that had ordered her husband's death had a stronghold. She burned it. Not with soldiers, not with siege weapons, but through a method so unexpected and so completely outside the normal logic of military action that people were still talking about it 100 years later. She used the city's own physical environment against it, turning ordinary things into the mechanism of its destruction. The specifics became legend precisely because they were so creative. Grief, it turns out, is a surprisingly effective design brief. What makes her story different from the others on this list is the scale of her patience. She did not strike once and call it done. She dismantled an entire power structure, piece by piece, over an extended period, and she did it while simultaneously governing, making decisions, managing alliances, and presenting to the outside world the image of a woman simply doing what needed to be done. The revenge was invisible inside the governance. That is what made it complete. Some people, when the world takes something from them, spend the rest of their lives trying to get it back. She decided getting it back was not enough. She decided the people responsible needed to understand, thoroughly and permanently, the cost of underestimating her. They did understand it in the end, just not in any way that was useful to them anymore. And now, from one of history's most creative acts of revenge, we move to one of its most bureaucratically deranged. Because if the previous story shows what happens when grief becomes strategy, the next one shows what happens when institutional hatred has no strategy at all, just a man with authority, a grudge that outlasted its original target, and apparently no one in his circle willing to say, "Sir, this has gone too far." The man at the center of the next story had been dead for the better part of a year when someone decided his death was not sufficient resolution. The person who decided this held the highest possible position of authority in his world, which meant that what happened next was not the act of a lone eccentric. It was an official proceeding. It had a date. It had a location. It had paperwork. They brought the body in, dressed it in its former official robes, the heavy fabric probably stiff and strange on a figure that no longer had the posture to fill it properly. They placed it upright in a chair at the front of a formal chamber. They appointed someone to stand beside it and speak on its behalf. Then they read out the charges. Read that again. They appointed someone to answer for a corpse in a legal proceeding that had been scheduled, organized, and staffed like any other official matter. Clerks had written documents. A date had been set. The room had been arranged. Every person involved had shown up and done their job as though this were a completely reasonable use of institutional resources. The verdict was delivered. Guilty. The former official's decisions were declared invalid. Everything he had done in his position was annulled. And then, because apparently the legal portion of the proceeding was not sufficient, the body itself was treated as a convicted criminal would be treated, mutilated, and disposed of in the river. What is so deeply unsettling about this story is not the horror of it, though it is horrifying. It is the calm around the horror. Nobody walked out. Nobody refused to participate. The whole event proceeded with the orderly rhythm of an institution doing paperwork, because at its core, that is exactly what it was. A man in power had decided that a dead enemy was still an enemy, and the system around him did not push back. It just processed the decision like any other administrative request. That is the real lesson of this story. Not that one person's hatred can reach beyond death, though apparently it can, but that institutions, when they are fully controlled by one person's psychology, stop being institutions at all. They become extensions of that person's obsessions, executing the requests of a wounded ego with the full weight and ceremony of official authority. And the most dangerous word in that whole equation is not hatred, it is paperwork. Because paperwork makes the unthinkable look like procedure, and procedure makes everyone feel like they are just doing their job. They executed the woman he loved on a Wednesday morning, and he became king 3 years later. And the first thing he did with his new power was make sure nobody in that kingdom would ever be allowed to forget what they had done. The killing had been political, clean and official, and wrapped in the language of state necessity, the kind of decision that powerful people make when a person without an army becomes inconvenient. She had no title that the court was willing to recognize, no allies in the right rooms, no mechanism to protect herself from people who had already made up their minds. The order came down, it was carried out, and the people who signed off on it went back to their other business, assuming the matter was closed. They were wrong about that in a way that would take years to fully reveal itself. When he finally held power, he moved against the men directly responsible with a speed and a totality that left no room for negotiation. That part of the story is well documented and not particularly surprising. A man with grief that old and authority that new was always going to settle that account first. What made his revenge extraordinary was not the punishment of the guilty. It was what he did next. He wanted her honored. Not privately, not symbolically, not in the quiet way that grief sometimes gets folded into a personal ritual. Publicly, officially, with a full weight and ceremony of the position she had been denied while she was alive. The court that had treated her as an inconvenience was now required to treat her as something else entirely. The people who had looked through her, or looked away, or simply gone along with what was happening because it was easier than objecting, all of them now had to stand and acknowledge her in the terms that had been withheld. Whether every detail of what followed happened exactly as the stories say is something historians have been arguing about for a long time. The stories have a habit of growing more dramatic with each retelling, as stories about love and grief and power tend to do. But the emotional core is real, and it is verifiable. He used his authority to rewrite her status, and he made the rewriting public, and he made attendance mandatory. The court had to show up. The court had to perform the acknowledgement. There was no polite absence, no quiet abstention, no way to avoid being seen as part of the recognition. That is what makes this revenge so unusual. It was not destruction. It was insistence. He was not taking anything away from the people who had wronged her. He was forcing them to give her something, the respect they had withheld, the acknowledgement they had denied, the public record they had tried to prevent. He turned their presence into their punishment. They had to look at what they had done and call it by its proper name. Some people spend their lives trying to undo loss. He did something different. He decided the loss could not be undone, and chose instead to make sure it could not be minimized. She had been denied a life. He refused to let her be denied a record. And in the long run, The record outlasted everyone in that room. That is a particular kind of revenge that most people never think about because it requires patience measured in years and power used with extraordinary precision. Not a weapon, an insistence, a refusal to let the story be told any other way. But now we leave the world of grand gestures and public ceremonies and step into something much quieter and in some ways much more devastating. Because the next story is about a woman who did not use power or armies or official ceremony. She used absence. And she used it so precisely that the whole world spent 2 weeks trying to figure out if her husband had done something terrible. The marriage had been fraying for a long time before it broke, the kind of slow unraveling that people inside it can feel but rarely name out loud. The gradual cooling of rooms that used to be warm, the conversations that get shorter and more careful, the sense that two people are increasingly performing a version of something that has already ended. She was a well-known woman, someone whose name carried public weight, whose life was followed by people who felt they had a stake in it. And when her husband came to her and said he wanted out, specifically that he wanted to be with someone else, the news moved quickly. The public expected the usual sequence: the tearful retreat, the dignified silence, the slow emergence of a woman putting her life back together in ways that would confirm she was the wronged party and confirm he was the one who had broken something that mattered. Instead, she vanished. Her personal belongings were found in an abandoned car several miles from their home. No note, no message, no indication of where she had gone or whether she had gone willingly. The story exploded overnight. Search parties went out in the cold and the dark, boots crunching through frost-covered fields, torchlight sweeping across empty landscape, volunteers fanning out across an increasingly wide radius, while the husband stood at the center of the investigation, wearing an expression that the press examined from every angle and found troubling. For nearly 2 weeks, the country held its breath. Theories multiplied and fed on each other. Accident, foul play, a breakdown so complete she had simply walked out of her own life. Something worse. Every theory circled back to the husband in some way, because that is always where these stories start. And he found himself fielding questions he could not answer about a woman he had wronged, who had now disappeared in a way that made his choices look extremely bad in public. She was found in a hotel, checked in under a false name. The name she had used was the surname of the other woman. Not a random alias, not a forgettable piece of fiction. The exact name of the person her husband had chosen over her, printed neatly in the hotel register for anyone who looked closely enough to see. She never explained it fully, not then and not later. She maintained that she had no clear memory of the period, that something had broken, and she had simply moved through those days without full awareness of her own actions. Maybe that was true. The mind does extraordinary things under extraordinary pressure, and what she had been through was genuinely extreme. But from the outside, the effect was identical, whether it was planned or not. Her husband had made her the victim of a private betrayal, and she had, somehow, turned that private betrayal into a public story, in which he spent 2 weeks looking like the most suspicious man in the country. She did not accuse him of anything. She did not need to. The shape of her disappearance did it for her. She had taken his private cruelty and given it a public form that he could not control or explain. or walk away from. And the name in the hotel register, that one small detail, was so perfectly aimed that it is almost impossible to read as accidental. Whether it was conscious or not, it was precise. It landed exactly where it needed to land. The story never fully closed. The ambiguity stayed, and it stayed in a way that kept him permanently associated with the worst possible version of events, even though nothing was ever proven, even though she herself never made a direct accusation. She had taken the shape of her own pain and turned it into something that followed him in a way that no formal accusation could have managed. And that is a kind of revenge that requires no planning, no resources, no allies, no army, not even a clear intention. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is simply make your wound visible in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. A man won a battle, took a throne, and then did something so quietly vicious that most people walk right past it without realizing what they are looking at. He did not celebrate with a speech. He did not hold a feast or ride through the streets accepting the noise of a crowd. The first serious business he attended to after the dust of the battlefield settled was a meeting with his clerks, a small room, candlelight, the smell of ink and old parchment, and a conversation about a date, specifically about moving a date backward by one day. The battle had happened on a particular morning. He had not been king when that morning began. Everyone in his new kingdom knew that, including every man who had fought against him. They had made a choice based on the political reality of the moment, and the political reality of that moment was that he was not yet in power. What they had done was not treason. It was a decision made by people living inside a specific set of facts. He changed the facts. Not the battle, not the outcome, not the physical reality of anything that had happened. He simply adjusted the official record of when his reign had begun. One day earlier. That was all it took. That single, quiet adjustment meant that every man who had raised a weapon against him had done so after he was already, technically and officially, their king. Which meant that what they had done was not a political choice made under a previous ruler. It was treason. And treason had consequences that were very different from the consequences of simply being on the losing side. Think about the elegance of that for a moment. No dramatic confrontation, no public accusation, no speech about betrayal or loyalty or the price of choosing wrong. Just a clerk with a quill making a small correction to a document. A correction that reached backward through time and reclassified the previous day as a crime. The men who had woken up that morning as soldiers, making a legitimate choice, went to sleep that night as criminals who had not yet been caught. He did not move against all of them immediately. Some were left to feel the change in the air first, to understand gradually what had happened to the ground beneath their feet. The uncertainty was part of the punishment. You wake up one morning and the thing you did yesterday, the thing that felt entirely reasonable in the moment, has been quietly reclassified into something that can be used against you at any point the new king finds convenient. You cannot undo it. You cannot argue against it. The paperwork has already been processed. That is what makes this story so much colder than the ones built on rage or grief or wounded pride. There is no heat in it at all. Just a man who understood that controlling the record is more durable than controlling the room, and who used that understanding with the calm precision of someone who had already decided the outcome and was simply arranging the documentation to match. Most of the revenge stories on this list come from people who felt something strongly and then acted on it. This one comes from a person who felt something, put the feeling aside, and then built a mechanism. A mechanism that could be used whenever he chose against whoever had ended up on the wrong side of that one small date change. That is not passion. That is architecture. And architecture, as we keep seeing, outlasts everything. But if that story makes you feel like revenge is a cold and calculated science, the next one will remind you that sometimes it is also an art form. Literally. Because what happens when the person you offend has the ability to make sure the entire world sees your humiliation? Permanently, on one of the most visited walls in human history. What happens is this. A man with significant institutional authority over a major artistic project decided to make his opinions known during the creation process. He was not the artist. He was the overseer, the official representative of the authority that had commissioned the work, the person whose job was administrative rather than creative. But he had a view, and he shared it, loudly and with complete confidence, in front of other people. The work, he said, was inappropriate, too raw, too exposed, more suitable for a place of low entertainment than a place of serious purpose. He wanted changes. He wanted restraint. He wanted the artist to understand that there were standards here and that this work was not meeting them. The artist listened, did not argue, did not defend the work in the moment. Just listened, nodded slightly, and went back to the scaffolding. When the work was finally unveiled, the official walked in with everyone else, looked up at the vast ceiling of painted figures, and found himself. Not as a saint, not as a witness to something holy, as a figure in the section reserved for the condemned, the damned, the permanently lost. His face was specific enough to be recognized by anyone who had seen him. His position in the composition placed him in a hierarchy of the irredeemable, and the details surrounding him, the ones that made people look twice and then lean in and then start to laugh, were designed with a precision that suggested the artist had been thinking about this for a while. The official complained. He went to the highest authority available and argued that the portrait was an outrage, a personal attack embedded in a sacred work, and that it should be painted over. The response he received was essentially that the artist had jurisdiction over hell, and that the official's position in it was therefore a matter of artistic judgment rather than administrative review. The painting stayed. It is still there. Every person who has walked into that space in the centuries since has seen it. The official's name is now inseparable from the story of a man who criticized something extraordinary and ended up as its most famous footnote, frozen in paint on one of the most scrutinized surfaces in the world, wearing an expression of permanent, public, inescapable humiliation. He wanted the work changed. Instead, the work changed how history remembers him. That is what happens when you hand someone a grievance and they happen to have a brush in their other hand. And speaking of people who turned personal wounds into something that outlasted everyone involved, the next story is about a ruler who decided that victory over her enemies was not enough, and that language itself needed to be recruited into the punishment. She did not execute her enemies. She did something that in many ways was worse. She made the entire empire say something insulting about them every single day without even realizing it. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what names meant in the kind of society she ruled. A family name was not just identification. It was history, lineage, status, the compressed record of everything your ancestors had built and everything you were allowed to claim because of them. It was the first thing people heard when you were introduced. It was written at the top of every official document, every land record, every legal proceeding. It followed you into every room before you had a chance to speak. She understood this completely. And when she finished dismantling the factions that had tried to block her rise to power, she did not stop at removing them from their positions or stripping their estates or sending them into exile. She went further. She had the official records amended so that the family names of her most significant enemies were replaced with new ones. Not neutral names, not forgettable substitutions. Names that meant things like coward, parasite, and creature that feeds on decay. Think about what that actually means in practice. Every clerk who processed a document involving one of these families now wrote an insult as a matter of routine. Every official who referenced them in a report embedded the humiliation into the language of governance without even thinking about it. Every record that would survive into future generations carried the mockery permanently, written in the same dry administrative hand as everything else, as though it were simply a fact about these people, rather than a punishment designed to outlast them. She was not satisfied with defeating her enemies in the present. She wanted the defeat encoded into the infrastructure of how they would be remembered. She wanted the humiliation to become so routine, so embedded in the ordinary functioning of the empire, that it stopped feeling like an attack and started feeling like a description. That is a completely different category of revenge from anything we have looked at so far. Not a gesture, not an event, a permanent architectural feature of how the world talked about certain people. The rivals who survived lived with this. They had to sign documents with these names. They had to introduce themselves with these names in rooms full of people who understood exactly what the names meant and who had put them there. Every formal occasion became a small, carefully designed humiliation that she had engineered from a distance and never needed to personally attend. Some people want to break their enemies. She wanted the empire itself to be the instrument of the breaking, operating automatically, requiring no further effort from her, running indefinitely on its own bureaucratic momentum. That is not just revenge. That is engineering. And it worked for exactly as long as her influence shaped the records, which was long enough to matter permanently. The lesson she left behind is uncomfortable because it is so applicable. Control the language that describes someone, and you do not need to control the person. The description does the work for you, in every room, at every hour, without you having to be present, or even alive. Words outlast the people who choose them. She knew that, and she used it with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of someone who intended to be remembered for centuries. But now, from a ruler who turned paperwork into punishment, we move to a woman who had no paperwork, no title, no institutional authority of any kind, and who responded to the destruction of everything she loved by becoming one of the most feared names on the open water. She had been a respected figure in her community, the kind of person whose position came from marriage and land and the slow accumulation of social weight over years. Then the authority she lived under decided her husband was a problem, and it solved the problem the way authorities tend to solve problems when they have decided the outcome in advance. His removal was official, legal, and completely beyond any appeal she could make within the system. The system had spoken. She was expected to absorb it and move on. She moved on in a direction nobody anticipated. The first thing she did was methodical. She assessed what she still had, which was less than before, but more than nothing. Property that could be converted to resources. Contacts that could be converted to crew. Knowledge of the shipping lanes and trade routes that ran through the water she had grown up near. The kind of knowledge that takes years to accumulate and that most people never think to use the way she was about to use it. She commissioned ships, not one, 3, and she made specific decisions about how those ships would look and be known. The color scheme was not accidental. She wanted anyone who saw her ships on the horizon to know immediately whose they were and what their presence meant. She was not interested in anonymous piracy, in hitting targets of opportunity and disappearing into the sea. She wanted the people who had destroyed her husband to know, every time a ship they cared about failed to come home, exactly who had taken it and exactly why. The attacks were targeted, not random coastal raiding, not the opportunistic violence of people desperate for resources, but deliberate strikes against the shipping interests most closely connected to the authority that had taken everything from her. She was not at war with the sea, or with commerce in general. She was at war with a specific set of people, and she had found the most effective way available to her to make that war felt. The detail that made her legend permanent was what she did with survivors. She left them, deliberately and consistently, because dead men carry no messages, and she needed the messages delivered. Every survivor who made it back to shore arrived carrying the same information, the same description of the ships, the same account of what had happened and what had been said before it happened. She was building a reputation the way someone builds a fire, feeding it carefully, making sure it stayed large enough to be seen from far away. The people she was targeting could not ignore it, could not classify it as random misfortune or bad weather or the ordinary risks of moving goods across open water. It had her name on it, or close enough to her name that everyone understood. She had taken her private grief and converted it into a public campaign that cost the people responsible something real and ongoing and impossible to write off as coincidence. Parts of what grew up around her story over time are probably embellishment. Legends attract thunder. But the core of it, a woman with nothing left to lose, who built something terrifying out of the wreckage of what had been done to her, that part has the ring of something that actually happened. Because the state that destroyed her husband made one calculation and forgot to account for one variable. It assumed her resources were exhausted. It forgot to account for her fury, which turned out to be a resource that did not run dry. And if that story is about what happens when the powerless find an unconventional source of power, the next one is about what happens when the most powerful institution in a society produces one man with a grudge and access to everything he needs to act on it. The man walked into the most powerful financial institution in the country, sat down across from the person who ran it, and told him to his face that the whole operation was corrupt and that he was the only one smart enough to fix it. That was his mistake. Not because the accusation was entirely wrong, because of who was sitting on the other side of the desk when he made it. The institution's director was not a loud man. People who met him for the first time were sometimes surprised by how quiet he was, how still, how completely without the kind of visible authority that most powerful people project into a room. He listened to the accusation with the patience of someone who had already decided how the conversation was going to end and was simply waiting for the other person to finish. He asked a few precise questions. He thanked the man for his time. Then he went back to his office and opened a drawer and took out a blank sheet of paper. The man who had made the accusation was a gifted operator, genuinely talented at working systems, finding gaps, moving through institutions with a kind of easy confidence that comes from never having been seriously caught. He had built a comfortable life on that talent. He had also, over the years, made enemies inside the institution he was now publicly mocking, and he had done it carelessly. The way people do when they are confident that confidence is enough protection. It was not enough protection against this particular man. The director began building a file, not dramatically, not with urgency or visible anger. He worked the way a craftsman works, steadily, methodically, one piece at a time, each addition to the record fitting against the previous one with quiet precision. He cultivated sources inside the networks the man moved through. He found people who had been on the wrong end of the man's schemes and who had information they were willing to share if approached correctly. He tracked financial threads that looked like nothing individually and looked like a complete picture when laid side by side. It took time, months of it. And during those months, the man continued operating with full confidence, continued making public statements, continued positioning himself as the person who understood the system better than the people running it. He had no idea that the person running it had essentially already finished the case and was simply waiting for the documentation to reach the point where it was airtight. The arrest, when it came, was quiet. No dramatic confrontation, no moment of visible triumph from the director. Just a process that had been set in motion a long time ago, arriving at its natural conclusion, the way a river arrives at the sea, not because of any single moment of effort, but because of the accumulated direction of everything that came before it. The man who had sat across that desk and explained why he was smarter than everyone in the room ended up convicted on multiple serious charges. The confident, loud, publicly visible figure who had made mockery of the institution became a case number in a file that the director had assembled with the care of someone building something meant to last. What stays with you about this story is not the outcome. Plenty of people get caught eventually. What stays with you is the silence of the man who caught him. No speeches, no announcements, no public satisfaction. Just work, done thoroughly, aimed with complete precision at exactly the right target. The director never needed to raise his voice because he had something better than volume. He had patience and a system that rewarded documentation over noise. The real threat in any room is never the loudest person. It is the one sitting quietly in the corner, deciding whether you are worth the effort. And once that decision is made, you will not know about it until the folder is already full. And that brings us, finally, to the last story, and also to the thing that all 33 of these stories, across every century and every corner of the world, are actually about. Strip away the armies and the warships and the legal documents and the painted walls and the adjusted dates. Strip away the purchased buildings and the prison cells and the birds with fire tied to them. Strip away every specific detail that makes each story unique, and what you find underneath is identical every single time. Someone felt small, and then they used everything they had to make sure the world paid for it. That is the engine. That is the thing that has been running underneath every single story you have heard today. Not ideology, not strategy, not grand historical forces moving civilizations in predetermined directions. A feeling. Specifically, the feeling of being dismissed, overlooked, underestimated, or wronged, landing in a person who happened to have the resources to respond at scale. Think about that for a moment. The commander who whipped a river did it because the storm had made him look incompetent in front of his army, and he could not tolerate that image of himself. The scientist who erased his rival's face from the record did it because decades of being challenged by that rival had left a wound that outlasted the man himself. The ruler who changed the names in the official register did it because she needed her victory to be total, not just political but linguistic, not just present but permanent. Every single one of them was responding to a version of the same original bruise. The scale varied enormously. The methods were wildly different. The consequences ranged from one man losing his job to entire cities being reshaped by siege and fire. But the seed was always the same small, very human thing. Wounded pride looking for a proportionate response and finding that it had no idea what proportionate meant. And here's the part that should make you slightly uncomfortable. The reason these stories feel so compelling, the reason you have been listening this long, is not just because they are spectacular or absurd or darkly funny. It is because every single person listening recognizes the feeling, the specific heat of being made to feel like nothing by someone who did not even think about it twice. The moment when something in you goes very quiet and very focused and starts asking how much you actually have to work with. Most of us do not have armies. Most of us cannot buy the building or redirect a river or paint someone into a permanent public humiliation on a famous wall. But the impulse, that exact impulse, lives in everyone who has ever been dismissed by someone with more power than sense. The difference between us and the people on this list is not the feeling. It is the resources. And maybe, just maybe, the absence of anyone willing to tell them to calm down before the warships were already on the water. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Think of the worst thing someone has ever done to you. The moment that stayed. The one you still think about sometimes in quiet rooms. Now honestly ask yourself, if you had the resources of a king or an emperor or someone with genuinely unlimited reach, what would you have done with that feeling? Be honest. The comments are right there, and I think the answers are going to be a lot more interesting than most people expect. If this story hit the way it was supposed to, leave a like and subscribe. There is a lot more where this came from, and the next one goes somewhere you are not going to see coming.